Sylvia Marin had not stepped foot in Hallowmere for nearly 50 years. The narrow, winding lanes that once felt familiar now seemed to twist strangely beneath her feet as she made her way from the train station to the old stone cottage that had belonged to her grandmother. The village had changed, though not in the way most places did with the passing of time. There were no gleaming new homes or tidy gardens filled with flowers. Instead, Hallowmere seemed to have shrunk in upon itself, the rows of cottages leaning closer, as if whispering secrets no outsider was meant to hear. The harbor, which had once teemed with fishing boats and bustling voices when Sylvia was a girl, lay empty and silent. Salt spray had worn the paint from the old boats left to rot at their moorings, their ribs exposed like the carcasses of beached whales. The gulls wheeled above in slow, silent circles, their cries muted by a heavy, leaden sky. She pulled her coat tighter as she passed the weathered sign that welcomed travelers to the village, its letters half faded and splintered from years of rain and wind. None of the few people she passed on the street spoke to her. They watched, though, with wary eyes that followed her progress from behind drawn curtains or from the shadows of low doorways. Sylvia recognized one or two faces from her childhood, though their names escaped her now, and they seemed to recognize her, too. Not as a friend returned, but as a stranger come back to stir all dust. When she reached her grandmother's house at last, she paused, staring up at the weathered facade as the wind tugged at her hair. The small cottage perched just above the rocky beach, its stones slick with salt and moss. She could almost hear the creak of her grandmother's rocking chair inside, almost smell the faint tang of wood smoke that used to linger about the place. But the house was cold and dark now. The key she had been sent weeks ago felt heavy in her palm as she fitted it into the old iron lock. The door groaned open, as if reluctant to let her pass. But Sylvia stepped over the threshold anyway. The interior was much as she remembered it. The low beam stained dark with age, the stone fireplace still blackened from years of use, and the worn armchair by the window where her grandmother had spent her days knitting or staring out at the gray sweep of sea. Dust motes swirled in the thin, slanting light that filtered through the salt-clouded panes. She set down her suitcase by the narrow stair and ran her fingers over the old sideboard, where her grandmother's collection of carved driftwood figures still stood in silent procession. Later, she found a kettle and made herself tea on the temperamental old stove. Sitting at the scarred wooden table as she tried to shake the feeling that she had stepped backward through time. As dusk approached, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The village below grew still, even the gulls falling silent as the light faded from the sky. She lit a single oil lamp and carried it to the window, staring out across the blackening waves. The sea here had always seemed darker than anywhere else, as if it hid something ancient and brooding beneath its surface. Sylvia's gaze drifted to the jagged outline of the cliffs to the west, where the old lighthouse stood, or rather, where it once had. The great storm of '52 had toppled it. They said the same storm that had taken the fleet, including her grandfather's ship, and with it, her grandmother's hope. It had never been rebuilt. Only the low stone base remained, choked with weeds and gull nests. But it was not the broken lighthouse that caught Sylvia's eye now. It was the faint flicker of light far down the shore, just above the tide line. At first, she thought it was a reflection of her own lamp, or perhaps the glimmer of another house's window in the distance. Yet as she watched, the light swayed gently from side to side, hovering in place, as though someone held a lantern and was walking slowly along the edge of the sea. No one walked there after dark. She knew that much. The tides came in fast, unpredictable. People whispered of how the sands could suck down an unwary traveler before they could cry out. And yet, the light moved with a strange deliberateness. Sylvia found herself holding her breath as it paused directly across from her cottage. Even through the thick glass, she thought she saw a pale, cold flame burning within a lantern of iron and glass. A shape hung in the air, no hand to hold it, no figure casting a shadow. It simply floated there, swaying ever so slightly, its glow faint but steady against the dark. It made no sense. The shadow lantern. They had called it in her grandmother's time. A relic of old stories told to frighten children. It had once hung from the lighthouse, the last beacon sailors would see before they made safe harbor. But when the storm came, it had vanished, said to have been lost with the fleet that night. Some claimed the sea had taken it, and some whispered it still guided the souls of those who never came home. Sylvia had dismissed such tales as childish fancies. Now, watching the light burn steadily in the deepening gloom, she was not so sure. The lantern flared once, brighter, and then was gone, snuffed out like a breath on a candle. Sylvia stared into the darkness long after, her tea cold in her hands, heart beating strangely in her chest. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced, her grandmother's voice, low and serious, telling her never to follow the light if it appeared. Some things don't come back, she had said, and some shouldn't. Yet as Sylvia stood there, she knew with a certainty that unsettled her more than the light itself. Tomorrow night, she would go down to the shore, and if the lantern appeared again, she would follow. The following evening came heavy with mist, the kind that clung low along the cobbled lanes of Hallowmere and softened the edges of the weather-beaten cottages. Sylvia spent the day in a strange hush, the hours unfolding like pages in a half-forgotten book, each moment pulling her closer to something she could not name. She had unpacked little from her suitcase, only enough to prepare simple meals and sweep away some of the dust that settled thick on the cottage shelves. But much of her time was spent sitting by the window, eyes drawn inevitably toward the shoreline, where the light had flared and vanished the night before. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of memory or age, perhaps a reflection of some fragment of glass. But the deeper part of her, the part that had listened to her grandmother's stories with a child's wonder and a woman's careful doubt, knew better. So as dusk bled once again across the sky, bruising the horizon with dark violets and rust-colored clouds, she donned her thickest wool coat, wrapped a scarf tightly about her neck, and pulled on her late husband's old boots, the ones he used for fishing in his younger days. They still smelled faintly of brine and old leather. With a small lantern in hand, she stepped outside, locking the door behind her more from habit than concern. The path to the beach was overgrown, tufts of grass pushing up between the cracked stones where she had once run barefoot as a girl, chasing gulls and searching for sea glass. Now, each step felt heavy, the hush of the village pressing close around her as if the place itself held its breath. No one watched from behind curtains this time. The windows were dark, shuttered tight, and the few lamps that flickered faintly in nearby cottages were quickly snuffed out as night came on. She reached the edge of the dunes as twilight thinned into something colder and more brittle, the sort of darkness that crept from the sea itself. And then she saw it again, the lantern. Its pale flame burned steady just beyond the tide line, hovering impossibly above the sand, as if cradled in an unseen hand. It did not flicker, despite the faint wind that stirred Sylvia's hair and tugged lightly at her scarf. It simply swayed, back and forth, like the slow rhythm of a cradle or a pendulum marking time long forgotten. For a moment she stood frozen, watching it. There was nothing threatening about it. Not at first. If anything, the glow had a gentle pull to it, like a memory half remembered, warm and familiar. Yet there was a solemnity to its presence, a sense that following it was not an invitation, but an obligation. Sylvia stepped forward, boots crunching softly over damp sand. With each step, the lantern moved, retreating slowly inland, not away, but ahead, as if guiding her along a path only it could see. She followed without question, her own lantern casting a duller glow that seemed somehow reluctant to compete with the spectral light ahead. It was not a long walk, yet it felt as though she crossed a threshold with every pace. The world behind her, the cottage, the village, the familiar salt-scented air slipped away into something quieter and more watchful. She became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed before. The faint hush of water beneath sand, as if something ancient breathed below her feet. The soft whisper of wind through grasses that grew in odd patterns across the dunes. and the occasional creak, like wood shifting on distant waves. Though the sea was far behind her now. After several minutes, the lantern came to a slow, deliberate stop. Sylvia halted a few paces behind it, her breath clouding in the cold air. The light hung above what appeared at first to be nothing more than a mound of grass and sand. But as she stepped closer, the shape of something man-made emerged. A grave marker, rough-hewn and simple, half swallowed by earth and time. Kneeling, she brushed away tufts of grass and a thin layer of damp sand, fingers numb but persistent. Beneath the grime, weathered letters revealed themselves, faint but unmistakable. Thomas Merrin. She drew in a slow, ragged breath. Her grandfather, lost at sea 70 years ago. During the Great Storm, the family had never recovered a body. There had been no funeral, only a cenotaph placed in the village churchyard where names without faces were mourned together. Yet here, on this forgotten rise above the beach, was a grave, a marker no one had ever spoken of, a burial no one had claimed to witness. Sylvia rested a trembling hand against the cold stone, its surface rough with lichen and age. The lantern's light pooled softly over the marker, its flame flaring slightly as if stirred by some invisible current. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint murmur beneath the breath of the wind. Not words, not song, but a resonance, low and thrumming, like the hum of an old engine deep underwater. She glanced around, expecting to find someone standing nearby. But she was alone. Save for the hovering lantern and the grave it had led her to. How had this come to be? Who had placed this marker here? And why had it been hidden, left to be reclaimed by sand and time? She thought of her grandmother, then stern, unbending Margaret Merrin, who had watched the sea with an expression carved from stone in the years after the storm. Had she known of this grave? Had she placed it here herself? Sylvia's thoughts tangled like kelp in the tide, questions surfacing only to sink again before she could grasp them. She reached into the pocket of her coat and drew out an old photograph, one of the few she had brought with her when she returned to Hallowmere. It showed her grandparents standing together at the harbor's edge, Thomas's arm around Margaret's shoulders, both smiling faintly beneath the brim of his cap. She laid the photo at the foot of the stone, weighing it down with a smooth, white pebble from her grandmother's garden. It felt right, though she wasn't sure why. When she rose again, the lantern had drifted higher, its flame pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Sylvia took a step back, expecting it to vanish as it had the night before. But it lingered a moment longer, then began to move again, slow and steady, back toward the shore. She followed it only as far as the dunes before stopping, her breath shallow in her chest. The light reached the tide line and paused, hovering just above the foam, before extinguishing with a faint flicker. Darkness reclaimed the beach. Sylvia stood there for a long while before turning back toward the cottage. She was not frightened, though perhaps she should have been. What she felt instead was a deep, settling certainty, as if something long suspended had begun to sink toward resolution. She returned home in silence, the wind brushing at her heels, and lit a lamp in the window facing the sea. She sat by it late into the night, watching the waves and waiting to see if the lantern would return. Morning in Hallowmere came slow and gray, the kind of light that seemed reluctant to rise, as if the sky itself hesitated to illuminate a village weighed down by too many untold stories. Sylvia stood by the window long after dawn, staring at the sea. Her thoughts circled like gulls over the tide, uneasy, searching, restless. She had dreamed of the lantern again, but not as it had appeared. This time it floated inside her grandmother's cottage, casting shifting shadows along walls lined with old photographs and faded maritime charts. In the dream, its light had fallen on faces she didn't recognize, faces pale and watchful, waiting for her to understand something she couldn't quite grasp. When she woke, the feeling lingered, heavy and cold. She dressed slowly, her movements stiff, her joints aching with a familiar dullness that told her the weather would turn. Rain was coming. By noon, the streets of Hallowmere remained empty, save for a few gulls that circled above, their cries ragged in the damp air. Sylvia walked the narrow lanes anyway, feeling oddly conspicuous in a village that had long stopped welcoming strangers, even ones who had once called it home. Windows were shuttered tight. Curtains twitched only once or twice as she passed. She found herself drifting toward the old bakery, though it had been boarded up for years. Across from it stood what had once been a row of modest townhouses, their doors now weathered to the color of driftwood. Only one still bore signs of life, a single window, curtained in yellowing lace, through which glowed the faintest trace of lamplight. Sylvia hesitated, then raised her hand and knocked gently on the door beside it. There was a pause, a long, brittle silence, and then the scrape of metal on wood as a bolt was slowly drawn back. The door opened a fraction, revealing an eye sharp and pale as sea glass, set deep into a face lined like ancient oak. "I know who you are," said the voice behind the door, dry but strong. "You're Margaret's girl." Sylvia inclined her head. "Granddaughter." The door creaked wider, enough to reveal Edna Gray. She was smaller than Sylvia remembered, shoulders hunched beneath a thick shawl, her thin white hair braided neatly and pinned close to her scalp. But her gaze was steady, and there was nothing frail in the way she held the door open and gestured for Sylvia to come in. The house smelled of dried lavender and old smoke, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that comes from years of isolation. Sylvia sat, when instructed, on a hard wooden chair by the fire, and said nothing at first. She waited. Edna poured tea with shaking hands, then settled herself across from her guest. It was some time before she spoke. "I saw the lantern last night," Sylvia finally said, voice low. Edna's expression did not change, but her gaze flickered toward the window. "You followed it," she said. Not a question. Sylvia nodded. "It led me to a grave. My grandfather's. I didn't know it was there." Edna was silent a long while. Then, "No one did, except maybe Margaret. But she never spoke of it." She sipped her tea, staring into the fire. "We all lost someone that night. My Henry was on one of those ships. Thomas Marin captained another." Her eyes grew distant, lost in memories that smelled of salt and storm winds. "It was a sudden squall, fierce, they said. But I think, no, I know it was something else." Sylvia leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Edna set her teacup down with care, her fingers white-knuckled on the handle. "The fleet sailed out under clear skies. 10 ships. They said the catches were better beyond the shoals, and the men were too eager. If you ask me, Hallowmere had been hungry that year." She looked at Sylvia then, her pale eyes fierce. "The storm came down fast." "Yes, but the sea wasn't just wild. It was angry. Angry." Sylvia repeated softly. "There are debts," Edna said. "Old ones. And the sea remembers." That's what they whispered back then, though few say it aloud anymore. She turned her face away, as if she could still hear them. The shadow lantern first lit after the fleet was lost. Not before after. Some thought it a blessing, others, not so much. Sylvia frowned. "What is it?" Edna's hands twisted the edge of her shawl as she spoke. "The lantern guides souls who won't rest. That's the story. The ones the sea won't give back. It leads the living to where they are needed, or where they are wanted." She met Sylvia's eyes again. "Sometimes it's the same thing, sometimes not." The fire cracked softly between them. "They say if you follow it, it shows you what you need to see," Edna continued, her voice rough now. "But there's always a price. Some never come back. Some come back, different." The room seemed smaller then, shadows crowding close despite the firelight. Sylvia shivered but did not look away. "But you saw it once," she said quietly. "Didn't you?" Edna's lips tightened. "Once was enough." They sat without speaking for some time. the weight of Edna's memories pressing down hard in the stillness. Finally, Sylvia rose, setting her empty teacup gently on the table. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Edna gave a small, grim nod but did not stand. Her eyes remained fixed on the window. "You shouldn't follow it again," she said, voice low. "Some doors don't shut once they are opened." Sylvia left the house with those words echoing in her mind. Stepping into the cool dusk that was already gathering like a tide, the sky above the village darkened in streaks of iron gray and faint orange. And though the wind had quieted, there was a sharpness to the air that made her draw her coat tighter around herself. She returned to her grandmother's cottage, lighting a single lamp in the window, her fingers trembling as she set it on the sill. She did not eat that night. Instead, she sat by the fire, Edna's warning replaying over and over, braided with the memory of her grandmother's silence, her mother's bitterness, and her own unresolved questions about the family she'd left behind for so many years. She had come back expecting to find answers in letters or old photographs, in familiar places worn soft by time. But now she realized the truth had been waiting elsewhere out there on the shore, in the restless dark where the sea whispered things it never spoke aloud by day. And when the first faint glimmer of the shadow lantern appeared again along the tide line, flaring as if it had been waiting for her to notice, she rose from her chair as if pulled by strings. The light was stronger this time, steadier. It hovered above the beach, pale as bone, swaying slowly. A heartbeat, a promise, a call. Sylvia hesitated only a moment before she stepped into her boots again, wrapped her scarf close, and opened the door. The night was cold and bright with stars, but the lantern's glow outshone them all. She followed. The lantern's light came again on the third night, flickering to life just as the last streaks of sun melted beneath the horizon. And Sylvia felt its call deepen like an ache behind her ribs. The wind was sharper now, carrying with it the salt iron scent of low tide and something older still, something like the coppery tang of blood or rusted chains. She lit no lamp within the cottage as she slipped her coat on and fastened her scarf with trembling fingers, knowing this time there would be no conversation, no lingering doubts, only a sense of quiet inevitability, as if each footstep had already been decided before it fell. Outside, the air was brittle, cold enough that each breath stung her throat, and the stars above gleamed like frost scattered across black slate. The shadow lantern waited for her where the dunes met the shingle beach, its pale glow casting long shadows over the sand, illuminating twisted skeins of seaweed and broken shells as if they were relics of a forgotten world. It did not hover long, nor sway in its usual slow rhythm. Instead, it darted forward with sudden purpose, and Sylvia found herself hurrying to keep pace, her boots crunching over driftwood and salt-slick stones as she followed it east toward the cliffs. The path grew narrower the farther she walked, the land falling away in sharp cuts of rock where the earth had given up its battle with time and tide long ago. Grass gave way to gravel, and then to uneven slabs of slate. Cold and slick beneath her soles, she climbed carefully, the lantern always just beyond arm's reach, leading her toward the jagged edge where land met sky. Below, the dark bowl of Hallowmere Bay stretched out in stillness. The tide receded farther than she remembered ever seeing it. In the distance, skeletal remains of wooden piers jutted from the sand like broken fingers reaching toward heaven. She hesitated for only a moment before beginning her descent. The cliff face was steep but passable where old steps had once been carved into the stone, their edges worn smooth by centuries of fishermen's boots. She moved slowly, gripping the damp rock with gloved hands, her breath loud in her ears, heart pounding a counterbeat to the faint hum that seemed to rise from the lantern's glow. The beach at the base of the cliffs was not sand but sharp stones and blackened driftwood, slick with brine. The lantern floated ahead, its light bright enough to reveal something more: dark timbers, ribs of a ship long drowned and only now revealed by the ebbing sea. The wreck lay half buried, its bow split open like a wound, beams twisted and gnarled with age, iron nails rusted to jagged points. Sylvia stared for a moment, transfixed by the sight of it. She had heard of wrecks washed ashore, the coast littered with them after the storm that had claimed her grandfather's life. But this felt different, familiar, though she could not explain why. The lantern's glow dimmed slightly, shifting to hover low over the splintered planks, and Sylvia followed it in a daze, slipping between broken timbers slick with moss and barnacles. The wreck's hollow interior smelled of rot and old salt, but also something subtler: cedar and faint pipe smoke, like a memory she hadn't summoned but couldn't dismiss. She knelt where the lantern hovered closest to the sand, its light falling on a shape half concealed beneath a rotting coil of rope. Her hands worked slowly, clearing away strands of kelp and damp silt until her fingers closed on something cold and hard. A compass, its brass casing dulled but intact. The initials carved into its lid were faint, but the letters still showed through. TM, her breath caught in her throat. Thomas Marin, her grandfather's name. The compass was heavy in her hand, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if the air itself thickened around her, as though something vast and unseen watched from beneath the waves. The tide, which had been at its lowest point when she arrived, began to shift. First a whisper, then a hiss as water lapped against the stones. But it was wrong. Too fast. The sea was returning quicker than it should, sliding in with unnatural speed, as if drawn by unseen hands or summoned by ancient command. Sylvia staggered upright, stuffing the compass into her pocket as she turned toward the cliff. The lantern had risen again, its glow brighter but more urgent, and it floated back toward the path she had descended. Waves rushed in now, dark and slick, swirling foam and broken kelp around the base of the wreck as it groaned softly beneath the sea's returning weight. She scrambled over the slippery rocks, her feet skidding more than once as she hurried after the lantern's path. The water followed close behind, dragging loose stones and driftwood in its pull, the wreck slipping further beneath the tide with each heartbeat. Her breathing grew ragged as she reached the first handholds of the cliff face and pulled herself upward. Hands scraped raw against the damp stone. Below, the wreck's ribs disappeared beneath the swelling sea, and for a moment, as she glanced back, she thought she saw something else move beneath the surface, something vast and pale that stirred the water as it passed, leaving silence in its wake. She climbed until her limbs ached, until the lantern's light was lost in the growing mist that crept along the cliffs, until she was back on level ground, knees buckling beneath her as she fell to the grass with a shuddering breath. The tide had swallowed the bay whole once more, leaving only restless waves and the distant cry of gulls in its place. But in her pocket, the compass pulsed with quiet warmth, as if it still pointed towards something unseen. Sylvia sat for a long time before she found the strength to stand. The lantern was gone again, but she knew it would return. It always returned, and each time, it led her deeper into the story she had come to unravel, one pulse, one memory, one buried truth at a time. She turned back toward the village, the faintest glimmer of dawn breaking on the horizon, and wondered if the sea had ever truly given back what it took. Sylvia returned to the cottage with the weight of the compass still heavy in her pocket, the imprint of its brass casing leaving a faint ache against her palm. The journey back from the cliffs had been slower than before, her legs weary, her chest hollow with the silence that followed the sea's retreat. But it was not just exhaustion that slowed her steps, it was the growing sense that something had shifted, as if the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the lost, had thinned. The moment she stepped inside, closing the swollen wooden door against the chill, the air of the house felt different, almost hushed, as though it too was listening. A faint smell of smoke clung to the walls, though the hearth had long since gone cold. Sylvia shrugged off her coat, fingers trembling as they brushed against the doorframe, worn smooth by generations of hands, her grandmother's, her mother's, perhaps even her own. As a child running in from the rain, she stood for a time in the stillness, letting the quiet settle around her, before moving toward the kitchen, drawn not by hunger but by something less certain, less nameable. The table was as she had left it, the map Edna Gray had drawn for her. Lines inked in shaky hands. The old oil lantern she had not yet dared to light. But there, beside them, lay something she was certain had not been there before. A small wooden box, no larger than a bread tin, its surface worn smooth by age and sea air. The grain darkened in places as though stained by brine. It bore her grandmother's initials, A.M., carved faintly on the lid, and beneath them, a faded mark she could not quite place, a series of concentric circles, intersected by a line that slashed through them like a crack in glass. For a long moment, Sylvia simply stared at it, feeling the steady thud of her heartbeat in her throat. Then she reached out, lifting the lid with careful fingers. Inside, resting atop layers of folded oilcloth, were letters, 6 in total, sealed with wax the color of old blood, their edges browned and brittle with age. Sheets. The date on the envelope was clear, the ink unfaded. October 12, 1957. 7 years after he had been declared lost at sea, she broke the seal with careful hands, unfolding the paper within. The handwriting was neat, the loops of each letter familiar in a way that twisted something deep in her chest. "My dearest Annabel," it began, "I hope this finds you well. I pray that the boy is strong and the girl fair, as you always hoped they would be. There are things I must tell you, things I did not understand until it was far too late. I am not where I should be, not where they said we would go. It is a place between tides, and I am not alone here. There are others. Some I remember from the fleet, but most I do not know. We are bound here, Annabel, by things we did not choose and cannot break. But I have found something, a way. I think there is a light. It comes with the dusk and shows the path to shore. I have followed it many times, but it always leads me back. I do not know if it can bring me home, but I believe it can lead me to you. If you see the light, know that I am near." Sylvia's breath caught as she read the final lines, the words blurring through the sting of unshed tears. The second letter bore a date 2 years later, and its contents were different, darker, more fragmented, as if something had begun to fray at the edges of Thomas's mind. "Annabel, the light is fading. I can no longer see the shore clearly. The lantern comes, but each time I follow, I lose more of myself. There are voices here that whisper when the tide turns.
And I fear what they say is true, that we are meant to be forgotten. But I hold fast to you. I will find my way back. I swear it. The third letter was worse still. The handwriting shook, words trailing into smudges. There was a strange mark in the margin, like a thumbprint dragged through ink. It spoke of darkness beneath the waves, of things that stirred when the moon hung lowest, of an ancient debt. They are restless now. The lantern leads them, but I do not know if it brings them peace. It may bring them only hunger. Annabel, I am so tired. But I will wait. The fourth and fifth letters were shorter, less coherent. Fragments of memories, their wedding day, the sound of her laughter when he brought home the first catch of spring. And again, a single phrase, follow the light. It will bring me home. But it was the sixth letter that Sylvia could barely bring herself to open. The date was blank. Only a single sentence graced the front of the envelope, written in an uneven scrawl. When the light returns, I will be waiting. The paper within was stained with something dark, the ink almost consumed by it. But the words remained legible, carved deep into the fibers of the page, as though pressed by a desperate hand. Is close now. The tides turn, and the lantern burns brighter. I see the shore. I see you. Annabel, wait for me. I am coming. Sylvia let the letter fall into her lap, the paper crackling faintly in the hush of the kitchen. Outside, the last rays of daylight faded entirely, and in their absence, a familiar glow returned, faint but steady, hovering near the edge of the dunes. The shadow lantern. It had come again. And in the fading echoes of her grandfather's words, she understood something deeper. It was not only a guide. It was a summons, a bridge between tides. And tonight it was waiting for her. She rose slowly, folding the letters back into their box, cradling them against her chest as she moved toward the door. The weight of them was like a heartbeat in her arms, steady, relentless. Beyond the window, the lantern bobbed in silence, its light casting long shadows across the sand. Sylvia's fingers found the compass once more, feeling its subtle warmth pulse in rhythm with the light. She stepped into the night, leaving the safety of the cottage behind, knowing there would be no turning back now. The sea called. The lantern waited. And perhaps, just perhaps, so did Thomas Merrin that on the third night, as the hour of dusk bled quietly into darkness, Sylvia Merrin stood by the window of her grandmother's old stone cottage, her thin fingers resting on the glass pane, as if the coolness might anchor her to the world she still understood. The shadow lantern had returned, brighter now than on the nights before, its glow pale and silvery, like a moon caught in a bottle, bobbing gently in the windless air just beyond the dunes. It did not hover near the shore as it had before, nor did it linger near the broken path to the cliffs. Instead, it moved inland, a slow, deliberate drift across the sodden fields, weaving a path through tall grasses brittle with salt. Something about its glow this time was different, less a flicker of guidance, and more a summons, brighter and steadier, as if it had gathered strength. Sylvia felt it deep within her bones, that same pull that had made her leave the comfort of the cottage before, only stronger now, undeniable, like the hush before a hymn's first note. She took up the old oil lantern from the table, though she did not light it. Its weight was reassuring in her hand, the brass handle cool to the touch. In her other hand, she carried the box of letters, though she had already memorized every curve of her grandfather's handwriting, every desperate word and plea. She stepped out into the mist that had begun to roll in from the moors, a thick and heavy blanket that softened the sharpness of the world around her. Hallowmere was quiet, as it always was after dark. The other cottages were shuttered tight, their chimneys cold. Only the faint glimmer of the lantern ahead of her offered direction, its silver light cutting a narrow path through the fog. Sylvia followed it without hesitation, the cold dampness of the night seeping into her long coat and scarf, her boots sinking deep into the soft earth as she crossed the fields beyond the village. There was an ache behind her ribs as she walked, a hollow awareness that what she followed now was something older than memory and deeper than grief. The path led her past landmarks she had not seen since childhood, the twisted remains of an iron gate that once marked the village edge, the hollow tree that children once dared each other to climb, the old stone well where, it was whispered, wishes went unanswered. All faded now, reclaimed by moss and mist. And then, as the lantern bobbed higher on an unseen breeze, Sylvia saw the place she had nearly forgotten. An overgrown graveyard on the low hill above Hallowmere, its iron fence rusted and sagging, the gate hanging by one hinge that groaned softly as it swayed. She had been here only once as a girl, clutching her grandmother's hand, told to stay silent and respectful. Back then the graves had seemed ancient. Now they looked as though they had been untouched for centuries. The stones leaned against one another like weary old men, their faces smoothed by wind and rain. Names had faded, dates were almost invisible, and in places the earth had sunken in unnatural hollows, as if someone had left in haste. The lantern waited for her just beyond the gate, casting its pale light over a low stone wall choked with ivy. Sylvia stepped through the gate, its rusted hinge creaking mournfully as she passed. The graveyard was still, except for the low hush of the mist swirling between stones, wrapping around her legs like something alive. The lantern moved again, leading her toward the back of the graveyard where the ground sloped sharply downward. There, set into the hillside and half consumed by vines, stood a stone mausoleum. Its roof was cracked, but the walls held firm. Over the heavy door, worn nearly smooth, was carved a single word in the old style, Marin. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. Her family. She stepped forward, each footfall muffled in the damp moss underfoot, and ran her hand across the name carved in the stone. The lantern hung directly above her now, its light no longer bobbing, but steady, fixed in place like a star, marking this lonely place. The heavy stone door gave easily beneath her hand, too easily. It scraped open just enough for her to slip inside, though the weight of the darkness was thicker than any she had known. Yet she did not light her lantern. The light from the shadow lantern followed her inside, illuminating a narrow chamber where dust should have blanketed every surface, but did not. The air was cold but not stale. The walls were clean, the stone polished, and the air carried the faint scent of brine and something metallic beneath it. There was no dust here, no cobwebs, no sign that time had touched this place. In the center of the room stood a single stone slab, unadorned, uncarved, its surface smooth. At its foot was an open space where an empty coffin lay, the lid set neatly against the wall. Sylvia stepped closer, every breath measured. The coffin was lined in dark wood, polished and clean, as if waiting for something or someone. She expected to feel fear, but what rose within her was something else, a sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been waiting for her all her life. And then she heard it, a faint melody, rising from beneath the stone slab. A slow, wordless song hummed just beneath the range of hearing, like voices raised softly in a hymn long forgotten by the living. It was beautiful and terrible in its beauty, a sound that made her heart ache with longing. And beneath the song, a voice, quiet but clear as a bell. "Sylvia," it whispered, and her name carried on the breath of a man she had never known, but recognized all the same. Thomas Marin, her grandfather. His voice was neither young nor old, but familiar, as if it had always been there, waiting behind the silence. "I am here," he whispered again, as if from beneath the slab, from beneath the stone, from beneath the weight of years and tides and sorrow. She pressed her hand flat against the cold surface, and for a moment, just a breath of a moment, she swore she felt warmth beneath it. A pulse, faint but steady. Alive. The lantern dimmed suddenly, and the song quieted. But she knew it was not the end. She drew in a long breath, her fingertips tingling where they met the stone. "I hear you," Sylvia whispered back. And in the quiet that followed, she thought she heard him sigh. It was not fear that kept her rooted there in the darkness. It was knowing she was closer now than ever before. That night, Sylvia slept uneasily in the small bed by the window, her breath misting faintly in the cold air of the cottage, despite the fire she had stoked earlier now burned low. The letters from her grandfather lay on the table, neatly stacked beneath the brass compass she had found near the wreck. Yet even their presence, which once offered some measure of comfort, could not still the unease knotting itself in her chest. And when sleep finally claimed her, it was thick and heavy as the sea itself, drawing her down into dreams that felt less like imaginings and more like memories, memories that could not be her own. She stood on the cliffs above Hallowmere Bay, the wind tearing at her hair, and though the sky was moonless, the clouds churned with sickly light, green and gray and glimmering faintly as if lit from within. Below, the sea raged, and in its black depths a dozen ships struggled against waves like towering walls of iron. Their sails were in tatters, the masts snapping one by one, each groan of timber lost beneath the roar of wind and water. The ships were going down one by one, vanishing into the darkness as though the sea itself were swallowing them whole. Sylvia knew without knowing that this was the night, the storm that had taken the fleet, taken her grandfather and so many others besides. Yet what chilled her more than the sight of the drowning ships was what she saw above them. On the cliff's edge, no more than a few paces from where she stood, were figures cloaked in darkness. They stood in silence, unmoving, as the ships perished below. Their faces were hidden deep beneath their hoods, but Sylvia sensed their watching eyes, cold and ancient. There were 7 of them, 1 for each ship, perhaps, or 1 for each soul lost that night. She could not say, but one among them raised a hand, and in it was a lantern, not the flickering golden flame of her childhood memories, but a cold white light that burned like bone under winter sun. Its glow was not warm, but sterile, pitiless, casting long shadows that did not waver in the wind. It was the shadow lantern, and its light was not a beacon of hope, but a summoning. Below, the sea surged in answer, and the ships were dragged beneath without a cry. Sylvia reached out in the dream, whether to stop them or to understand, she did not know, but her hand passed through mist as cold as death. And then she woke, suddenly, violently, as if torn from some deep place too long submerged. She sat bolt upright in her bed, her breath ragged, the blankets tangled around her legs. The room was dark, save for the faintest glow of pre-dawn light edging the window pane. Yet something was wrong. The scent reached her first, sharp and unmistakable, salt brine, kelp, and wet wood, as though the sea itself had seeped through the stones of her cottage. She swung her legs to the floor and froze. Beneath her bare feet, dampness spread across the wooden planks. Seaweed, slick, dark, glistening, lay tangled like strands of hair across the threshold of her door. Small shells, pale as bone, were scattered as if left by a retreating tide. And the brine smell thickened as she stepped forward. Her heart hammered as she checked the door. It was locked, bolted from the inside, just as she had left it. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. A single trail of wetness led from the door toward the center of the cottage and stopped abruptly beneath the table where her grandfather's letters still lay. The brass compass was open now, though she had left it shut, its needle spinning slowly in slow, lazy circles. She drew a breath to call out, though to whom, she could not have said, but the sound caught in her throat as she crossed to the window. Outside, the light was growing stronger, the pale silver of a cloud-choked dawn. And the tide, God's help her, the tide was lower than she had ever seen it in all her years by this shore. The water had retreated far beyond its usual place, revealing long swaths of wet sand and glimmering black rock. But more than that, it had uncovered something else. A path. Stones, ancient and worn smooth, arched gently out of the bay like the bones of some great creature, disappearing far into the distance where the mist hung heavy over the water. It was no natural formation, she knew instantly. The stones were laid with purpose, their surface inscribed faintly with markings that even from this distance seemed to shimmer faintly in the half-light. A road, or a bridge, leading from the shore out into the heart of the bay. She had never seen its like, nor had she ever heard stories of such a path. But here it was, undeniable and waiting. Sylvia's fingers trembled as she reached for the latch on the window. She needed air, though the cold bite of it did little to settle her. The shadow lantern hung low in the sky, just above the water's edge where the path began. Its pale glow pooled across the wet stones, beckoning. She did not bother changing from her nightdress, only pulling her grandmother's heavy shawl around her shoulders before stepping outside, her boots half-laced and damp before she reached the garden gate. The village was still, its shutters closed, its chimneys cold. There were no eyes at the windows today. No one stirred. It was as if the whole of Hallowmere had vanished, leaving her alone to walk the uncovered path. The stones were slick beneath her feet, but they held firm as she stepped from the safety of the sand onto the first stone. The sea lay flat on either side, the waters dark and still, as if holding its breath. The lantern drifted farther now, moving out along the path ahead of her, and she followed, each step steady, though her heart raced in her chest. The mist thickened as she moved farther from shore, swallowing the village behind her until there was nothing but water and sky and the faint gray line of stone beneath her feet. She did not know how long she walked. Time seemed strange here. The air was heavy, and the distant cry of gulls seemed muffled, as though heard through water. And then she saw it, an island or the remains of one, barely more than a rise of stone breaking the surface of the bay. Upon it stood ruins, tumbled walls, a shattered archway, and what remained of a great bell tower, though the bell itself was gone. It was not marked on any map she remembered, nor had anyone ever spoken of it. Yet she knew, with the same certainty as she had known the path would appear, that this place had waited beneath the water for longer than she could comprehend. The lantern stopped before the archway, its light illuminating faint carvings on the stone, ships, waves, and beneath them, figures with arms raised not in supplication, but surrender. Sylvia stepped forward, her hand brushing the stone as she passed beneath it. Beyond lay the remains of a chapel, the roof long fallen in, but the walls still bearing traces of ancient frescoes faded by water and time. And in the center, on an altar of black stone, lay a single object, the lantern. The real lantern, she knew, not its ghostly reflection. Its flame burned steady and white. As she approached, the wind rose, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice she had heard only in dreams, her grandfather's voice, calling her name once more. The sky was a bruised indigo when Sylvia left the stone ruin behind, the faint glow of the lantern bobbing steadily ahead, its light paling only slightly in the deepening dusk. She followed, her feet steady upon the submerged path that glistened wetly beneath the twilight sky, stones slick beneath her worn boots, though she barely noticed the cold seeping through the cracked leather. The water lapped soundlessly at the edges of the stones as she walked, a strange hush upon the bay that made every sound she made seem louder than it should be. Each breath, each scuff of her soul, the faint whisper of her shawl brushing her sleeves. Yet still she pressed on, driven not by fear or duty now, but by something deeper, a quiet understanding that the path was meant for her alone, that whatever was left to discover had waited all these years for this moment beneath the weight of dark waters and darker silence. The lantern's glow softened as they left the ruin behind, the broken chapel swallowed once more by rising mist, and as the last archway faded from view, Sylvia felt the slightest shift beneath her feet. The stones grew warmer, almost imperceptibly, and the faintest thrum passed through them, like a heartbeat pulsing up through her soles and into her legs. Ahead, the path widened gradually, the stones forming not a road now, but a circle, broad, ancient, ringed with low pillars that breached the surface of the water like teeth. Some were worn smooth by centuries of tide, others cracked down their length with narrow fissures filled with shadows, but each bore carvings that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Spirals, knots, and sigils Sylvia did not recognize, but felt as though she should. The lantern hovered at the center of this place, its pale flame flickering gently in the windless air, illuminating what lay within the ring, a great stone tablet, half sunken in brine, its surface carved deep with words and images that seemed to shift beneath her gaze. She stepped closer, the pulse of the stones beneath her feet quickening faintly, and she knelt beside the tablet, bracing one hand against its slick surface as she leaned in to read. The language was old, older than the village, older even than the stone paths themselves, but some part of her mind turned the shapes into meaning, as though remembering something long buried, rather than learning it for the first time. The story told itself in symbols and names, half lost to time, but heavy with weight. There had once been a bargain struck between the people of Hallomeer and something ancient that dwelled in the deep places beneath the bay, in the black wells far below the ocean's floor. The old ones, the first mariners, the text called them, had learned to fish the richest waters, to harvest the sea without fear of famine or storm, but the bounty came at a price. The pact was not one of blood, but of remembrance. Each year, as the harvest moon rose, the villagers were to light the lantern at the water's edge to call home their dead, and to honor the ones lost to sea and time. So long as the lantern burned and the names were spoken, the old ones would hold back what lay beneath, and the souls of the drowned would find their rest, passing into the deeper quiet beyond the world of men. But there came a year of greed or pride or simple forgetting, when the lantern was not lit. The dead were not called, the names were not spoken, and in that silence something stirred. The pact broken, the drowned souls, those who had trusted to be guided home, became stranded, neither of sea nor land, caught adrift between worlds. Worse, without the lantern's light to guide them, they wandered in the dark, their voices lost in the tides, their sorrow feeding something older and hungrier that waited beneath the deepest trenches of the bay. The villagers, in their fear, had tried to make amends. They built the chapel on the reef, they rang the great bell to call the souls back, they raised prayers and burned offerings, but it was too late. Storm upon storm broke the fleet, the sea reclaimed the land, and the light was extinguished for 70 years. Until now. Sylvia traced the final line of the inscription, its meaning chilling in its simplicity. When the lantern returns, the path opens, and the toll must be answered. She sat back on her heels, her breath shallow as she stared at the words. Toll. The old stories had always spoken of tolls, but never what they were or who paid them. She thought of her grandfather, Thomas Marin, who had sailed that night with the others, never to return. She thought of the letters she found in her grandmother's trunk, letters dated long after his death, his words speaking of following the lantern home. He had not been the only one. That much was clear now. The drowned souls of Hallomeer's fleet, the lost men and women whose names were carved on weathered stones by the chapel ruins, whose families had long since faded into memory, none had found their peace. They were still out there, somewhere between here and the deep. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence around her, but it was no longer empty. Beneath the hush of the still water, there was a sound, a low rhythmic pulse, like the slow tolling of a bell deep beneath the waves. Not the chapel bell, but something older, stranger. A calling, a summoning, and the lantern still hung there, its flame steady, waiting. Sylvia's hands shook as she reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish like a trick of mist and moonlight. But the brass was solid beneath her fingers, warm to the touch, and the flame within it flared brighter for a moment, casting long shadows across the stones. As she lifted it, the carvings on the pillars glowed faintly, and the pulse beneath her feet steadied, as if the place itself recognized her. She thought of Edna Gray's warning, of those who followed the lantern's call and never returned. But she understood now. They had not vanished in fear. They had walked the path, as she had. They had sought to answer the toll. And in doing so, they had become part of the story, bound in remembrance, as guardians, as witnesses. Sylvia stood slowly, the lantern in her grasp, its weight far heavier than it should be, yet familiar. She turned back toward the shore, though it was lost in mist. Somewhere behind her lay the cottage, the old village, the life she had left behind. But ahead, or perhaps beneath her feet, the dead still waited. The toll had yet to be paid. The night before Sylvia's final journey, Hallomeer held its breath. There was no wind to stir the sea, no gulls to cry from the cliffs, only the distant, slow rhythm of the tide against the rocks, a lullaby for a village long accustomed to waiting. Sylvia stood at the threshold of her grandmother's stone cottage, her fingers brushing the worn handle of the lantern she had polished and prepared, the same her grandmother had once tended on dark nights, when she believed no one watched. Its brass frame caught the faintest glimmer of moonlight, and within the glass, the pale flame of the shadow lantern danced softly, as though breathing. She lifted it, her hand steady despite the weight of knowing, and crossed the shore's uneven stones to where an old rowboat waited, its hull patched with care, as if in anticipation of this moment. The village behind her remained dark, its windows shuttered, its streets empty, but Sylvia knew eyes watched from behind curtains, holding old fears close to their hearts. They would not speak of it. Not yet. She pushed the boat into the shallows, the water colder than she expected even after all these years by the sea. With practiced ease, she climbed in, settling the lantern at the bow, where it cast a narrow path across the dark water, and took up the oars. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight as she rowed, the slow rhythm of her movements matching the beat of something deeper, the pulse she had felt beneath the stones at the circle, the heartbeat of a pact old as the tides. The further she traveled from shore, the smoother the water became, until it stilled entirely, turning glassy and black as polished obsidian beneath the growing dawn. Behind her, the cliffs of Hallowmere faded into mist. Before her, the lantern's glow grew stronger, as though drawing her forward, lighting the way over water that felt less and less like sea and more like sky turned upside down. The stars above seemed reflected in the depths, though Sylvia knew the truth. There was nothing beneath her now but shadow and memory. She rowed until the oars no longer met resistance, until it felt as though she drifted in air. The lantern slowed then, its flame steady, hovering just above the surface. Sylvia set down the oars and sat still, listening. At first, she heard nothing but her own breathing, calm despite everything. Then, softly at first, came the sound of oars dipping into water, not her own. She turned her head and saw them, boats, dozens of them, gliding silently through the dark, emerging from mist that swirled like torn linen. Pale faces watched her from each vessel, their forms hazy at the edges, as though light passed through them, but their eyes, dark, wide, and longing, held hers. They did not speak, nor did their hands move to row, and yet their crafts drifted forward, encircling her small boat in a widening ring. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat as she saw him. Thomas Merrin. He stood in the closest skiff, his figure clearer than the others, wearing the dark coat she remembered from her childhood, its collar turned up against a cold wind that did not blow. His face was thinner than in the photographs, but unmistakably his, lined not with age, but with waiting. He stepped forward, the planks of his boat creaking not with wood but with memory, and raised his hand as if to touch her, though they remained separated by more than space. Sylvia felt tears sting her eyes, hot against the cold mist, but she did not cry. She had waited too long for this moment to waste it on grief. Instead, she reached into the satchel at her side and drew forth the compass, the one she had found at the wreck, the one bearing his initials scratched faint but deep into the lid. Its metal gleamed faintly in the lantern's light. She held it out to him, resting it upon her open palm as she whispered the words she had learned from the carved stone tablet beneath the sea. The language was old and heavy on her tongue, but it rang true, as though the sea itself remembered. As she spoke, the compass rose from her hand as if lifted by unseen fingers, crossing the space between them in slow, reverent grace. Thomas reached out, his ghostly fingers closing over it with care. The moment his hand closed upon the compass, the lantern's light flared, no longer pale but golden, rich and warm like sunrise on a winter's morning. Around them, the other boats began to shift, their forms softening, becoming less distinct as though releasing the last hold they had on this world. But their faces were peaceful now, their longing replaced with something gentler, acceptance perhaps, or relief. Thomas smiled faintly. His lips moved as though speaking her name, but no sound reached her ears, and yet she heard it deep within her chest, where old wounds had scarred over. A wind stirred then, not from the sea, but from beyond the mist, carrying with it the faintest strains of song. Voices layered one atop another, rising and falling like the tide, singing not of sorrow but of farewell. It was not a song of mourning, but of release. Sylvia closed her eyes as the hymn passed over her, warm as the sun rising behind her. When she opened them again, the boats were gone. The sea was empty and still, the mist rolling away toward the horizon, as though called elsewhere. Only her boat remained, and the lantern, its light now steady and calm. She looked around, the expanse of water gleaming with the first true dawn Hallowmere had seen in decades. For a long moment, she sat there, letting the silence settle, not heavy, but clean. When she finally turned the boat toward shore, the oars slid easily through the water. Behind her, the lantern still glowed, but its flame was quiet now. She did not need it to guide her home. Morning broke over Hallowmere in a hush, as if the sea itself exhaled a long-held breath. The harbor that had slept in silence for 70 years now stirred gently under soft, golden light, the tide lapping at worn stones in rhythms long forgotten but never truly lost. Sylvia stood at the edge of the village, near the crooked post where once the shadow lantern had hung lifeless, its iron hook rusted by salt and time. Now the lantern hung there again, not because someone had placed it, but because it had chosen to remain, swaying faintly in a breeze that smelled of brine and wildflowers. Its flame glowed low and warm, not the ghostly flicker of restless souls, but a steady gleam, like the last embers of a hearth fire at night, offering comfort rather than warning. Sylvia touched its base with weathered fingers, her hand steady, as if she had always known this would be her task in the end. She smiled faintly, a small, private gesture that softened the lines of her face, and then turned back toward the village with slow, deliberate steps. The walk to the cottage felt different now, though the cobbles remained uneven and the grass grew wild between them. The silence was no longer hollow. It had weight, but was no longer heavy. It was the kind of silence that settled over a place where things had been put right, where unfinished songs had finally been sung to their final note. She pushed open the old wooden door of her grandmother's home, the iron latch still squeaking in the same familiar way. Inside, the air was lighter somehow. There was no longer the faint chill in the walls that once made the house seem larger and emptier than it was. The hearth was cold but not lonely. She set the small lantern she had carried with her all those nights on the windowsill above the kitchen table. It was made of brass, the edges softened by years of polishing, and its glass had long since taken on a gentle amber hue. That evening, as twilight settled softly over Hallowmere, Sylvia struck a match and lit the lantern's wick. The flame caught easily, rising steady and calm, casting its gentle glow out over the shore, across the dunes where the graves lay tended now, and out toward the quiet line of the tide. Some nights she found herself sitting by the window, her tea cooling in its cup, watching that light in silence. Other nights she would walk the village paths, stopping to talk with Edna Gray or nodding to others who had begun, slowly, to emerge from their homes again. They spoke softly of the sea these days, not of what had been lost, but of what was remembered. Sylvia wrote in the evenings, her handwriting still sure despite the slight tremor in her fingers. She recorded everything, not just what she had seen and done, but what she had learned of the village's old ways, the bargains made, the songs sung at midsummer and midwinter, the quiet prayers whispered to the waves. She wrote about Thomas Merrin and the compass, about the circle of stones beneath the tide, about the promise made when the lantern was first lit. It was not a story of horror, she realized, but of belonging, of understanding that some debts were too deep to measure in years, and some love too strong to sink entirely beneath the water. She left the pages bound neatly with twine on the shelf by the door, where whoever came after her might find them. She did not know if anyone would come. It did not matter. On clear nights, when the sea was calm and the stars bright, she often stood by the shoreline listening. Sometimes she thought she heard faint music, a hymn caught in the wind's hollow, carrying a tune that once guided sailors home. At other times, she simply listened to the rhythm of the waves and found peace in their simple constancy. The villagers, once silent and wary, now spoke freely again. They planted flowers along the harbor, white lilies and red poppies, and mended the old nets that hung in the sheds. Boats did not go out as they once had, fishing had long since faded, but the ships were made seaworthy again, and children played in them, at low tide. The bell in the church was rung again, softly, for the first time in decades, not to summon, but to remember. Sylvia's days grew quieter as the months passed, but she did not mind. She found solace in the rituals, the lighting of the lantern, the tending of the graves, the stories shared in whispers around kitchen tables and over steaming cups of tea. And always, she kept her own lantern lit at dusk, its golden flame a steady promise that some light remained, even after all else had gone. Sometimes, she dreamed of Thomas standing by the edge of the water, his hand raised in greeting, his face softened by the light of the lantern. In those dreams, he never spoke, but he didn't need to. She knew he was home. And in the mornings, she would wake to find the tide had drawn lower than it should, leaving smooth stones like offerings on the sand, and sea glass glinting where the sun rose over the bay. Sylvia Marin lived out her days in Hallowmere, never once regretting her return. She had answered the call of the shadow lantern, and in doing so, had given voice to the lost and peace to the living. Long after she was gone, villagers said her lantern still burned in the window of the old stone cottage, its flame as steady as the stars. They told stories of her to their children, who watched the sea with curiosity instead of fear, and left their own lanterns by the shore on clear nights. Some said that if you stood very still by the water's edge at dusk, you could hear the faint sound of oars dipping into water far beyond sight, and voices singing an old song that promised safe passage and safe return. And when the light from the shadow lantern gleamed at the harbor's mouth, they did not fear it. They knew it was only guiding someone home. The next morning, as the mist peeled away from the hills like lifting veils, Sylvia Marin stood at the window of her grandmother's cottage, her weathered hands resting on the frame where salt had etched delicate patterns into the old wood. Beyond the glass, the sea lay quiet, the water smooth as slate and shining faintly beneath a sky the color of pale linen. The shadow lantern hung in its place by the old harbor post, swaying gently on a breath of wind too faint to feel. Its glow was no longer sharp or unsettling, but soft, as if it had finally found peace in its purpose. Sylvia watched it for a long while before turning away, the old ache in her knees reminding her to move slowly, with the same deliberateness she had learned in all things since returning to Hallowmere. The village had changed. Not in obvious ways. The streets remained crooked, the rooftops leaned into one another as though sharing quiet secrets, and the harbor stones still bore the scars of centuries, but in the way silence felt. Once hollow, heavy with things unsaid and songs unsung, it was now full of breath, of memory acknowledged rather than buried. Even the gulls' cries sounded different, as though their calls no longer echoed unanswered. Sylvia kept her days simple, tending the garden behind the cottage where wild thyme and lavender had grown unchecked, thriving in the salt-soaked air. She cleared the brambles from the old path leading to the family plot in the hills, placing fresh white stones along the way so others might follow when the time came. There was no longer fear in the villagers' eyes when they spoke of the Marin name, only a solemn kind of respect and sometimes gratitude, though they did not always say it aloud. They came to her door quietly in the evenings, bringing offerings of bread and preserves or baskets of driftwood polished smooth by the sea, and she welcomed them with tea and gentle words. They wanted to hear the stories now, not to shrink from them, but to understand. So she told them of the storm, and the fleets swallowed by waves, and the old pact made in desperation and darkness. She told them of the shadow lantern, of how it had flickered into life to call her home, and of the stone circle beneath the bay where the voices of the lost had waited so long to be freed. She spoke not of curses, but of promises broken and remade, and the cost of forgetting where you came from. Some wept as they listened. Others took her hand as they left. Edna Gray visited most often, and together they tended the graves that had been overlooked for generations. They righted fallen stones and cleaned weather-worn names with care, speaking them aloud into the quiet air, as though calling the dead gently back into remembrance. At dusk, they lit lanterns along the low wall by the shore, their flames bobbing in the twilight breeze like small stars, their glow reflected in the darkening waters. Sylvia often found herself walking to the harbor at night, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by the quiet footsteps of those who had begun to trust again. The shadow lantern remained ever constant, its light drawing no fear now, but quiet reassurance. They had come to see it not as a warning, but as a sign that no one was truly lost. On one such night, when the air was thick with the scent of rain, and the sea murmured low and restless, Sylvia stood at the water's edge and spoke aloud to the tide. She told Thomas Merrin of the life she had lived beyond Hallowmere, of the years she had spent away from the shore, and how the city lights had never quite drowned out the sound of waves in her memory. She told him of the day she returned, and of how she had followed the lantern's call without knowing why, only that she must. And she thanked him for waiting, for calling, for showing her the way back to herself. The lantern swayed then, its light flaring softly as if in answer, and she felt a warmth at her back, the sense of a hand steadying her shoulder. It was gone as quickly as it came, but she stood there a while longer, comforted by its brief return. Days blended softly into seasons. The first spring saw flowers blooming in places long bare, yellow primroses on the cliffs where the old paths ran, and pale sea pinks clustering along the stone causeway, revealed at low tide. Children played there now, their laughter light and fearless, running races along the old tracks where once no feet had dared tread. In the midsummer months, the villagers gathered at the water's edge in the fading light, carrying lanterns of their own design, some simple, some elaborate, their glass panes painted with scenes of the sea and sky, of ships and stars. They floated them out into the bay on small rafts woven from reeds, the lights drifting away in gentle processions, their reflections shimmering like constellations fallen into the sea. Sylvia sat quietly among them, watching the lanterns go, her own lamp resting on her lap, its steady glow warming her hands. The stories they told had changed too. No longer whispered behind closed shutters or told in fear to frighten wayward children. The tales of Hallowmere became songs sung in the tavern on stormy nights, poems scratched into the margins of books, and lullabies hummed by mothers watching the waves. They spoke of the sea not as a hungry thing, but as an old keeper of memory, a place where stories waited to be found again, carried by tides and sung by lantern light. Sylvia finished her writings in the autumn of her 3rd year back. She bound the pages herself, the leather soft and worn from her hands, the ink faded in places where her tears had smudged it, but legible still. She placed it upon the mantel above the cold hearth, beneath the carved mantelpiece where once a ship's figurehead had stood watch. She left it there for whoever might come next. She no longer dreamed of storms. Now her sleep was filled with calm seas and distant bells, and sometimes the sound of oars dipping in water, slow and steady, carrying her farther into light. The day she did not wake, the village gathered without summons. They found her in her chair by the window, her hand resting lightly on the brass lantern's base, its flame still burning brightly. Edna Gray led the quiet procession to the family plot on the hill, and they buried her beneath the flowering hawthorn, her grave marked simply with her name and the words, "She followed the light home." Long after, they said her lantern remained lit in the window, and on certain nights when the tide was low and the winds were right, it was joined by others. Lanterns, they said, that floated from far beyond the bay, carried by hands unseen, their light steady as they came home to Hallowmere. and the villagers no longer feared the shadow lantern when it flickered to life at dusk. They knew it was only guiding someone home.